Welcome to Global Risk Community Chat. Today, our guest is Rory McCune. I'm very happy to have you here today, Rory. Welcome.
Thanks very much for having me along.
Yes, likewise. I'm glad to see you today here. So before we get into our topic, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure, yes. So I'm a cloud native security advocate at Aqua Security. We're a cloud native security company. And prior to that, I've been working in sort of information and IT security for about 20 years now, around various organizations like financial services companies and consultancies.
Yeah, super nice. I hear a lot of experience in that industry or field, essentially. So let's then jump into the topic. What would you like to share with us today?
Sure. So I think what I wanted to talk about was obviously where I focus my time now, which is cloud native and container security. It's a field I've been working in for about 5 years now. And one of the reasons why I work in this field is because we're seeing huge growth in the number of companies making use of cloud native technologies, making use of container technologies. And obviously, with any new technology area that comes along, risk people need to understand a bit about what makes this different. What do we need to think about here that's maybe different to the sort of things we've been doing in the past? And I was giving some thought to this, before we started, and thinking, how would I describe it? And it really comes down to three themes, I think. The first one is talking about our supply chains. The way that cloud native and container security works is there's a large number of open source components. So people are pulling together different things they find on the internet and creating and packaging things. That obviously means we've got a complicated stack, and there's lots of places where things can go wrong. And what we've seen over the last year or two is attackers are recognized this, and they're trying to compromise people's supply chains. So you have the things like the complexity of tracking vulnerabilities. How do I say, if there's a vulnerability in one component made by someone in one country, suddenly my systems are compromised? So I think organizations need to think about that. How are they tracking their supply chains? How are they making sure they understand the components that they've got in place and making sure that they know what vulnerabilities might be in them and how to fix those? That's definitely something we're seeing as a kind of increasing problem. There's also in that the fact that companies do all their development on the internet now, and this is exposing people's systems to a lot of attack. They make use of a lot of software as a service, so a lot of kind of like third-party services. And we've seen this happen already, that attackers are targeting these software as a service providers and saying, if I can compromise you, I can compromise all of your customers. And so that's another place where risk professionals need to, get on top of what's happening, is their developers are probably using all these external services. What's going on? How are those external services secured? And how are they checked to make sure that they're okay? So that comes again into supply chain. And I think that's somewhere that people definitely should be placing an increasing focus. The next area I think that kind of comes to me as part of this field from my background in kind of like traditional enterprise IT security is that a lot of the tools that we're making use of now that are being very heavily deployed by big companies are essentially coming from the developer world. So they're written by developers for developers, and they're written to do things quickly, to do things easily, and to really make sure that development can proceed fast. What that means is they're not always optimized for security. So they're not always kind of deployed with the idea of this is going to be very locked down by default. So this software, like, for example, is a tool called Kubernetes, which is very heavily used by big organizations and sort of government organizations. And it's not out of the box very hardened. It's not locked down. And so from a risk perspective, the thing here we'd be saying is, well, you've got all these new tools you're using, you've got all these new software and services. How are you hardening them? How are you locking them down? How are you making sure that these things aren't, as they come out by default? And also, in addition to that, they don't actually, they don't really provide all the services you would need. So they don't provide a complete security picture. And so you need to think about what additional external software do I need to add to make these things properly, sort of enterprise ready. And that's kind of, and I think people need to be thinking in general about the software they're using, because as I said, a lot of these tools are really not designed for enterprise use, so they weren't grown up that way. So that's a kind of another area to work. And the third theme I think that kind of came to my mind was how people need to have different ways of working. So containerization is this technology that I use, and the idea of containers is you can create these kind of self-packaged applications, and it lets you move your applications around easily. So the idea here is that developers can put something on their laptop and they can create an application, they can get it working, And then they can move that application to anywhere and have it work seamlessly. And this is great, right? It really has improved the way people write code and really deploy their applications. But from a risk and security perspective, there are some consequences. There are things that have changed, things that people need to think. And this is this bit about what's happened here, what's changed from the way we used to work. That means we have to adapt our security and our risk practices. With containers, they are ephemeral. And what that means is that an individual container will come and go, right? It'll pop up, it'll run for some time, and it'll go away again. And that means that things like patch management, how do we manage software patching, changes as well. Because usually we used to log into a system, we'd apply a security patch when one was needed, and we'd have a secure system or a patched system. Now we don't do that. What you need to do is you need to redeploy. So you get this kind of template and you apply the patch there, and then you redeploy it. So it's a different mindset. It's a way we need to change how we're thinking about how we're working with software. And that definitely, I've seen that as kind of a flip round. In my kind of traditional security days, the idea that, if you had a system that had been up for a long time, that was a mark of quality. Your system had been running, it was stable. Now, if I see a system that's been running more than a month, I think that's not being patched because it needs to be redeployed when it's patched. So if I see a long uptime, I'm thinking there's something going wrong there. So it's a change in our mindset. The other thing that I think that changes is we also have to change how we handle secrets, credentials, passwords, because you can't put them into containers. If you put them in containers, those things are publicly held. You have to be very careful not to do that. So we need, again, external software, external systems. So for risk departments, I think this is a question of asking their IT teams, how are you handling this? Getting a policy, make sure you've got policies in place. You say, okay, we've changed our way of working. Do we have the policies and practices and procedures in place that are actually going to help us continue to work securely? The other one that I think that comes in terms of a different way of working is that now we're seeing people have their entire environments deployed as code. So everything they do is written in various different scripting languages. And this is great because you can redeploy whole environments. You've got a problem, you have an incident, you can redeploy the entire environment from the code. But it means we have to change our way of working. We have to get rid of this idea of administrators logging into systems and patching them, because that doesn't work anymore, because then if I redeploy it, that patch is missing. So everything has to be done and disciplined to work in this kind of way where everything is code and we work that way. And I think that can really improve security. So it's kind of a positive. It's not all risks and things we have to worry about. There are actually some things that improve. And that, to my mind, is definitely one of them. And so those are kind of the three main themes. I think if I was kind of coming up with like what's the kind of message here, what do you need to think about? It's you need to look at what's changed. Development is changing. It's moving very quickly now. I mean, these systems that are, you used to see software that was supported for 10 years. Now, if you get a year's support, you're doing well. So people need to think about how is that changing our mindset? How do we need to change how we work? And how do we actually sort of, adapt to this to make sure we're still, as secure as we were?
Yeah, actually, I think you also summarized quite a bit on like how, like some of the key things that I think risk managers should definitely start thinking about. A lot of, I hear a lot of parts on like the third parties being involved or supply or on the software. And so I think indeed the risk managers should be now needing to focus a lot on a lot of different aspects when it comes to these things and think about a lot of possibilities, but also risk, but again opportunities as well, because obviously it can also be a positive thing for their day-to-day risk management, I hear. So I want to ask perhaps like one very small question or one like small takeaway, which is if you were to just summarize everything in one sentence, or if you would want somebody to implement or start implementing things in one sentence, what would be the thing they should start implementing first?
I think what I would do is try and track where all your software and systems is and make sure you actually understand your dependencies. Where is my software coming from? How is it being handled?
Yeah. Super important point, I think, to start with. I completely agree. Then we are just going to be moving on our last question as we are running a bit out of time. And that is how it is for you to be part of risk community in general.
I think it's really great. I mean, I've been in security 20 years, and it's fun to see how things have adapted, but also to an extent stayed the same. We've got a lot of similar problems, but maybe just looking at them in different ways as new emerging software develops.
Yeah, super cool. Thank you as well for then sharing that insight as well. It's interesting to always hear out, like how experts in other fields also look into the risk part from a certain angle. So yeah, that unfortunately kind of concludes our time for today. I wish I could hear more. I think there was a lot of like I wish we could go depth into all the aspects or things to think about in more depth perhaps next time. But thank you so much for joining us today in our Global Risk Community Chat.
No problem. Thanks very much.
Yes, and have a great day.
Cool. Thank you. Cheers.